Okay, so we're moving on to the next section, which is conservation outside of protected areas. And this is chapter 9 in your book. And so the reason we're talking about this is that protected areas are just not enough. Why? They're often too small. There may be important resources outside of them. Some species may need to migrate, so they need to move through areas to get from one protected area to the next. Politics or funding may prevent the establishment of more or bigger protected areas. So the alternative to trying to make bigger and bigger protected areas is conservation on other types of land and water. And some types of land use may not be conducive to protecting biodiversity, but some can at least help in small parts. Some can help in large parts. So with this, we come to this idea called reconciliation ecology, and I'm going to expect you to know what this is. But the main idea is how we can promote conservation in human-dominated landscapes. The idea is, instead of thinking of people and nature as separate, as thinking about how people can facilitate nature. It's thinking about sustainable use, about promoting green space, and cooperation between protected areas and other land use types. And I think this is really exciting because this idea of reconciliation ecology is the idea that you don't have to be an ecologist or a conservation biologist to do conservation. The idea is that you could do conservation in your backyard. If there are green spaces where you work, you could promote conservation no matter what you do. And so thinking about this as any community member can facilitate conservation, that's really the core idea here in reconciliation ecology. So I want to read you this quote. "The park boundary is often a psychological boundary, suggesting that since nature is taken care of by the national park, we can abuse the surrounding lands, isolating the national park as an island of habitat, which is subject to the usual increased threats that go with insularity." Insularity meaning being an island, a habitat island. And conservation is compatible with lots of land use types. We only need to think about how it could work and try it out. And I'm not saying that we can maybe conserve elephants in the middle of New York City kind of idea, but that doesn't mean that we couldn't conserve butterflies or frogs or something small. We can always make room for a little bit of conservation no matter what kind of land use we're talking about. And that's this idea here. So some of examples of this are green roofs. We can grow flowering plants. We can grow shrubs. This roof even has trees on it, so there could be nesting birds. There could be important insect pollinators, all being facilitated by these green roofs. Natural landscaping, or something called xeriscaping, can help us have native plants all around us. That is important for pollinators and for birds. So a lot of times you'll see that these are ways that we can conserve smaller things. But there's no reason that we couldn't do conservation for our pollinators, which are a really important ecosystem service, everywhere that we have a little bit of spare land. Xeriscaping is landscaping in a way that uses minimal irrigation. So out in the West, where water is much more limiting, this idea of xeriscaping is having plants that can survive in the native ecosystem, as opposed to constantly watering them and picking plants because they look nice, picking plants so that we can have landscaping that needs minimal maintenance. So I wanted to talk about a few plants that could be planted more often where we live. And so a lot of times people plant, and you'll see in the spring, you will see these trees everywhere suddenly be all white. And you'll notice that all of the branches come together at a single place. This is a very poorly designed tree. It's called the Bradford pear, but it's also called the calorie pear. And there's this, they have the tendency when it rains to have these big branches fall off on your car if you park next to one. So they're not very good as a street tree anyway. But these are invasive. This is an invasive species that we don't want. You could instead plant flowering dogwoods, which also have these beautiful white flowers, and they're native and they're actually declining. Similarly, people plant crepe myrtles everywhere for their beautiful colors, but we have azaleas, which are native. Some of them are cultivated varieties, but it is a native type of shrubbery that our pollinators and birds can use for habitat. These are some other examples. This is a red bud tree that has these beautiful pink or purple colors. Louisiana is known for Louisiana irises, which are a special kind of native wildflower. This is a passion fruit flower that makes a delicious fruit that box turtles and different birds and mammals love to eat. And this is a native kind of mint that makes this beautiful flower as well. So there are lots of native plants that can provide the same kind of landscaping aesthetic that you might want that people normally will pick their plants for, but you can do the same things with native plants. So by choosing native plants, we're promoting biodiversity in our own yards and in landscaping wherever we have control over landscaping. This shows some different kinds of land use, and we have on the y-axis things that are very controlled processes to uncontrolled or free processes. And then down here we have patterns that go from artificial to natural. So the most controlled and artificial are like urban and industrial development. If we go along this more natural but still very controlled axis, we get to things like city parks and other sorts of parks that are planned very carefully, but are more natural because they have more plants, more wildlife. If we go along this way to where we have controlled but free, we have things that are still all in this artificial category. So from cities, we go up to things like intensive agriculture and degraded wildlands. They're not being controlled, but they're very artificial environments. And then if we go to this axis, the things that are the least controlled and the most natural are things like wilderness, national park, multi-use forests, and then we get everything in between, from more traditional agriculture to more exurban and suburban neighborhoods. The value of unprotected areas is that some rare species live mostly or only on private lands. Some examples are that 60% of the United States Endangered Species Act listed species live on private forest land. Outside of the United States, 75% of orangutans live outside of protected areas. And so this is common, so we need to think of ways to bridge conservation to these unprotected areas. So here's another example. The Florida panther is found on both public lands by about 69% and 31% private lands in South Florida. And interestingly, they actually have better diets and are in better condition on private lands. And so this shows some of that data. The green dots are radiotelemetry records for Florida panthers, and we see that the red are the public lands, so this is Everglades National Park right here, but there's some other public lands scattered in, but these spaces in between have Florida panthers, but are not protected areas. This shows data from West Africa, and it looks at a variety of different habitat types, different intensity of human impacts on the x-axis, and the number of species found on the y-axis. And it breaks them up into native forest species, open habitat species, and you can see the clear cut was not evaluated. But you can see there's a large number of species if we look at the baseline and logged forest, so around 50 species. The baseline forest is all native forest species, whereas the logged forest has a combination of native forest species and open habitat species. But if we get down here to things like fields, tree plantations, perennial crops, annual crops, we're still getting half or more of the species that you would get in baseline forests. So there is still some conservation value to these if only we can work to facilitate that instead of working against that. There are a variety of types of different unprotected areas. And we'll go through a few of these. I'm just going to list them briefly and then we'll go through them in more detail. There's military land, unprotected forest, unprotected grasslands, which include things like the side of the road and the power line right-of-ways, unprotected waters, and undesirable land, and private land. And so we'll go through all of these when we're talking about conservation in unprotected areas.